Hello and welcome to Panorama Consulting Group's webinar today. My name is Jennifer Oldemeyer. I am Senior Marketing Strategist at Panorama Consulting Group, and I'm going to be the host and moderator today. I'll be chatting with some of the most knowledgeable minds in the world of ERP failure. We'll be discussing the basics of ERP project recovery so you can determine if this is the right path for you. This is the second webinar in our three-part series. In our first webinar, we talked about a variety of scenarios, but today we're just talking about project recovery. We'll be going into a lot more detail so you can see how it might apply to your own project. I'd like to introduce two project recovery professionals from our software expert witness practice, Bill Bauman and Joe Ambrose. Could you both please introduce yourselves?
Thanks, Jennifer. My name's Joe Ambrose. I've been with Panorama a little over 3 years, been in the ERP space well over 25 years. I'm responsible for the ERP practice on the delivery side, teamed with Bill Bauman to help a variety of different customers in a variety of different situations. But that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, and I'm Bill Bauman. As Joe mentioned, I work with him. We spend a lot of time working in our expert witness practice, working with clients that are going through recovery as well as litigation and many of the places in between there. So happy to be able to hopefully give you some more information today.
Thank you for that. I'm sure there will be many questions about this subject matter, so you're invited to submit your questions in the questions panel, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Before handing the baton to Bill and Joe, I'll do a quick introduction of Panorama Consulting Group. Panorama is an independent enterprise software consulting firm specializing in everything from ERP selection to ERP implementation to business process management. Panorama serves a number of different markets, from manufacturing to field service to government. The Panorama team has done several hundred software consulting engagements. They have a broad range of customers in terms of size, location, and industry. Panorama has also had the opportunity to work with a great number of software vendors. This not only includes ERP, but also warehouse management systems, CRM systems, and other types of enterprise software. Joe, could you provide an overview of Panorama's expert witness practice?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. So, as Jennifer mentioned, we actually have two sides of the Panorama house. We have the side that Bill and I are involved in both sides, but where we actually help companies that are looking to explore and select a new enterprise type software. And then we have the second side is based on our expertise in that arena. Over the last 10 years, we started an expert witness practice, given the fact that we had a lot of companies and our law firms that called us to really try and help them understand, what went wrong in this situation, what went wrong in this ERP, really help them understand, why the implementation wasn't successful. With that said as well, we also have, so that's the software side. So on the software side, we also have what we call a project recovery, which is, it doesn't necessarily need to be a lawsuit. It's sometimes companies come to us and say, look, we've been at this for a while. We're 6 to 7 months overdue. We're way over the budget. So we're just looking for somebody to kind of help us get this project back on track. And again, with our experience and what we do on a regular basis, we have a process and an offering that really can help them get that back on track, get it started again, which it would include a variety of things, not only from a project management perspective, but also, once we get it if we can get it to go live, we have a variety of different ways we can help, continue to make sure that project is going to be successful beyond go live. So that's really the left side of this grid, which is the project recovery enterprise. The projects aren't going good. We try and get them back on track. Obviously, the right side of our offering here, the litigation support, when things are past the point of no return, legal teams are involved on both sides. We provide experts in that arena. We have a couple different ways we help. Sometimes we just do an actual assessment to both sides, one side, both sides. We work on both the plaintiff and defendant side. It's really depends on the particular case. But just giving them our opinion as to do you have a case or not. So that's really more on the assessment side. Obviously, from a litigation support, litigation's already going. We have experts that can really dissect the case, help the legal teams in deposition preparation, testifying experts, provide a variety of different things. So it really depends on the clients. Obviously, if we're getting a call that they're trying to save it, we go that direction. If it's already past that, we have a full service offering to be able to help from an expert witness perspective.
So you guys are essentially recovery experts. What makes you different from other software consulting firms?
Well, that's a good question. You mean software selection consulting firms or software consulting firms? Because from a software selection consulting firm, I think we're different in, again, we are software agnostic. So we have no relationship with any software companies, and we have received no compensation for them. We don't implement software. We help more on a project oversight or an organizational change perspective. What differentiates us compared to a lot of other selection consulting companies is, we have our expert witness offering, which many do not, and also leveraging our experience. Our consultants average well over 20 to 25 years of ERP implementation and enterprise software implementation experience. So we leverage that from the perspective of understanding what the best practices are and really trying to help get these projects back on track when we can. So I think that's what differentiates us from most other software selection companies.
I think the other thing that I would add is when we look at a project, we're looking at it as a business initiative. It's not a technical initiative. So we're looking at the project holistically, and that also follows through in terms of our methodology. We like to talk to clients or prospects when they come in very early, when they're just thinking about, should I upgrade my current software? Should I, replace it? And that's really when we want to start talking to them. We go through an assessment process. We help them to figure out what kind of software would be the best solution for them. And also the organizational change, the people issues that go along with that. Joe would tell you, as well as myself, 90% of the expert witness cases where we're getting involved in looking at litigation are mostly about people issues. They're about failures, turnover in PMO, lack of training or insufficient training, and almost all of them either have an insufficient or a lack of an organizational change management plan when they go into an implementation.
Yeah.
And again, because we see it again and again and again, this is not just kind of, we read about this, we see it every day when these cases come in. So when we're looking at things from, the helping someone do a successful implementation, we know you've got to address the people side, you've got to address the process side as well as the technology side. And we're there to help them not only through the assessment and selection, but through those, the process, the people I just talked about, as well as implementation, and even post go live, helping them to do audits to make sure they're realizing the KPIs they were expecting to get when they put the system in. So again, we like to look at the whole gamut of the services that are required to do a successful implementation.
Hey, Jennifer, would you like me to speak to a current situation on the project recovery side that we're working with a client? That might be a good example of some of the stuff that we do.
Yeah, sure, we can. And then we can move on to the topic of today's webinar.
As an example of a current project from a project recovery perspective, the client called us and said, look, we're way over budget. We're way past time. We've added scope numerous times. We really don't know where the end point for this project is. We started to lose the team structure from our internal side and also from the consulting side. And they just needed somebody to come in and say, hey, let's just kind of reset everything, right? At some point when you're over the projected go live date, everybody's scrambling on both sides just to try and get the project to go live. And And we're coming in now from an outside perspective and really trying to get back to some of the basics. Let's get back to some of the project management principles and some of, managing the budget, putting together some change management, some communication, some training plans and the like. But in this case, it's not past the point of no return. It just was leveraging our experience from when things go well and when things go bad, and really just trying to get back to the basics on this thing so we have a clear path to go live. So that's an example of just something that we're working with today.
Great. So today's webinar is specifically about signs that project recovery may not be feasible. So determining whether or not your project is recoverable. How can an organization determine if project recovery is feasible if it's too late?
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of this, Bill, did you want me to take a crack at this first on some of the key things that we see?
Yeah, please. And then I'll just add as it makes sense.
Yeah. So again, we talked, and I just used an example of just one of the different projects that we're working on currently. But lack of readiness, that could mean a lot of things, but really lack of readiness can be a few things. One is lack of commitment from the executive team, which is what we're talking about in the second one. Lack of commitment to really keep this thing going. I think what happens in these projects, it's a huge initiative for a company. You plan on a 1-year go live. You think you're ready for it, but then once the implementer comes in, they're asking for all kinds of resource demands from your people. You didn't really plan on them doing their full-time job, and this is a full-time job. When the implementers come in, they got to get going. They're under contract. They know what it takes to get this thing up and running. So they're going to be pushing. So I think when companies, you can start seeing this relatively quickly when they start falling behind right from the get-go. It's not 6 months in and we're falling behind. It's like we're just not getting off to a good start. And as mentioned, what happens is, at this point, sometimes the relationships between the executives from the client side and maybe the software side start to get pointing fingers, and, things aren't on good terms. Sometimes from that perspective, it's past the point of no return. Too many promises have been made and broken, maybe on both sides. Other signs, from a technology perspective that we've seen, we thought this was a good solution. And as you start getting deeper into the requirements, you soon find out that technology isn't a great fit as we hopefully thought it would, or some of your future state planning, it'd be great to be able to do X and Y, and you find out, well, the current technology that you're purchasing or that you have purchased is not going to be the best fit going forward. Which again, I've talked about the last one again, the second to last one, lost momentum. Anytime you get to the go live and you don't go live, you're losing momentum, and it's hard to keep the organization on track. It becomes a secondary task. Folks start going back to their full-time job as a top priority. You start losing momentum because you're not tracking the project against objectives. You're not tracking the project against budget. And then finally, and this is a recent case that we had, a lot of team members started leaving. And that's the worst thing, especially project leads from we had a recent case where out of the 3 major project team leads, all 3 of them left the company. And they're trying to hire for new ones, and there's just nobody to backfill that. So in this case, there just maybe is a situation where the company's not ready, or it's not a good track to be successful moving forward with the current implementation. Bill, any thoughts on recapping all that?
Yeah, Joe, you used the R word, requirements. One of the things that when we walk into a case, we ask them, okay, can you show us what you did in terms of gathering requirements in your selection process? Oh, you didn't do requirements? Well, how is it possible to do a selection of a piece of software without knowing what your requirements are? That's always a big one right there. If they bought software without understanding their requirements, and then the implementer comes in to try and implement the software, and they start gathering requirements and find out, hey, there's a bunch of things here this software won't even do. There you got a real big red flag that recovery is going to be difficult. You may be able to put some bolt-ons. You might be able to do some configuration to address some of those issues. But if you've missed any major differentiators for that organization, recovery is going to be very difficult. And again, I would just also reiterate, the commitment, not only on the executive part, but the core team and the folks that are involved in putting the software or getting it implemented. And if they haven't had sufficient backfill, if management hasn't made it possible for them to be able to put a fully dedicated effort or a significant effort into the implementation, the possibility of the implementation going wrong are going to be very high, and then recovery will be even worse because recovery takes more effort than implementation. So now I've got to not only got to do just my job plus implementation. Now I've got to try to go back and try to correct things that happen. So recovery is not a simple process, but the end goal of trying to keep the software and the investment that's been made, if possible, is what you want to get. But it's certainly much more difficult than a standard implementation.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to add, Bill, was another key area where things get derailed very quickly in the project is on the initial design docs. A lot of times that's done in the sales process where you start mapping out, what actually is going to be in the implementation. We had a recent case where I've seen some significant change orders, change order 2 and 3 and 4 that are substantially different from the initial design doc. And again, that'll immediately throw off the budget that you initially thought about, the timelines. So spending some more time on that upfront piece and really making sure you understand the different phases, what's going to be implemented, what are you purchasing, what do you really need out of this software. We see that more and more with just a complete change in scope from the initial design documents that were actually used to get agreement and secure a contract for this initiative. So really important to take that due diligence time up front to make sure you know exactly what you want this new system to do and what's actually going to be provided.
All right. Thank you for that. In the last webinar, you talked about a few recoveries you did and their success, but what about the ones that weren't successful? Can you talk about those?
Sure. There's not, we never like to go down this road, but there are times where, either we get called in, it's just too late, or we'll do some sort of assessment and just find out that, we're not quite sure we're going to be able to get where they need to get. But as I mentioned earlier, that whole, the relationship between the client and the vendor has gotten to such a point where it's just there's a trust issue, and they're already past the point of no return. A lot of times what happens in this situation is the project goes on like a hiatus for a while. It might be a 2 or 3, 4 months, and then trying to get that thing back up and running and getting the momentum back is very difficult. So we've had projects like that where it was past the point of no return. Didn't want the software anymore. I mean, that's usually as an outcome of when maybe it's not that they didn't want it. It's just that things aren't going so well. So we're either going to stay with our own system or potentially need to find another one. If you go back and think about the process, especially if you work with Panorama, if you go through the process of narrowing it down to a short list of vendors, most of those vendors are going to work. So didn't want the software anymore usually is a symptom that things just aren't going right, and they may just retrench back to where they are. Any comments on those first two, Bill? And I'll move on to the other ones.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of marriage counseling, where we're the marriage counselors. You've got two parties. They obviously have conflict. Some people are willing to put the work in to try and resolve conflict. Others are just, I don't ever want to see that person again. And, I don't care what they say. It's the same situation here. That the animosity builds. It means you can't have collaboration. And even if you come up with a good solution for them, okay, we can save the software if we do this, or we put this bolt on it, they don't want to hear it. It's just, I want the software out of here, and the implementer or the vendor I'll never work with those folks again. So that's, one of the biggest things is if they can come to the table and be reasonable, they're never going to get rid of their all their emotions, but can they be reasonable in terms of their approach? The other thing, that comes up is team fatigue. The people that have actually been doing this on both sides, right? Again, implementer as well as the client. They've been working, in some cases it can be years together, and they're not showing any progress. And again, they get burned out. And now you're saying, well, let's do a recovery, and we're going to start this project, and you're going to have another 9 months. So if those people, again, if they haven't been backfilled and if they can't be shown that there is a good degree of, a good probability of success coming from the recovery, that can be one of the things that will also derail your recovery.
And Bill, that brings me to another point that I just thought of as you were talking. The lack of measurable success measures in the project management of this is a killer, because if you should be able to see things and signs, like if your status reports are accurate, or if you actually had success measures and say, look, if we're at this stage of the project, we're going to be on track to go live. A lot of times it's just that's not in place, and then by the time you start saying, wow, we could use some help, somebody coming in here. One of the things that we provide is an oversight service. It's not that we have to necessarily come in all the time and just be a PM. It's like, hey, can we just sit kind of on top of both of you and make sure that we can keep this thing going? But I think having those success measures in place at different intervals of the project and really evaluating them will help you catch things before it gets too quick. Before it gets too far down the road where it makes recovery even harder. And then finally, the last two here, vendor refuses to address complaints. Again, too far off track. That whole vendor refuse to address complaints, that usually comes around scope issues. It's very, scope management is one of the most key factors that throw these things off track. I'm going to go back to that design document up front. What did you buy? What was part of that initial design document? And we know that you can't always get everything that you want in that design doc, but a lot of times when the complaints that vendors really refuse to address are those that are out of scope and those that may require additional compensation to be able to get those in scope. So again, scope management, managing to what what was needed up front, putting together a plan to execute against that, and evaluating that on a regular basis is key. And then we've kind of talked about too far off track of timeline and budget. At some point, it's where do we start over? You've gone down the road with customizations or adding other things, or now you're getting in the weeds on some smaller things that you need. Maybe you want an invoice to look X and Y, and pretty soon you're not focusing on the big picture anymore, and all these smaller tasks that are easier to check off the issue list become top priority, and you just keep going off timeline and budget. So that's a pretty typical. We see the last one almost on every project. Bill, any thoughts?
No, I think you summed it up well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate both of you breaking this down for the project managers and project team members in attendance today. We have a few questions here that came in. One of them is, you talked about how you can help companies that are in a failing implementation, but what can you do to help us avoid getting into a bad implementation?
Wow.
Go ahead, Bill.
That's a big question. That's a big question. Yeah. Well, how can you avoid getting into a bad implementation? We talked about a number of things. Frankly, planning is one of the biggest things you can do. We have a term, I guess it's out there too. It's called pre-implementation. So this is basically preparing for an implementation. So you've gotten to the point, you know what your software is. You've got your implementer selected or your system integrator, and now it's time to actually say, oh, they're going to be in here whenever, in 2 months. Well, there's so many things you can do in terms of answering things like, let's restructure our chart of accounts. Let's get that figured out before they show up. Data migration, the data migration strategy. Let's get that lined out. Let's try to figure out what we're going to do and how the data is going to be cleansed, who's going to do it, again, before the implementer gets on site. Process changes. There's a lot of things that this new software will address because it's typically got best practices in it, but there's other things that the organization's been doing because they've been in business for however many years, and they just kind of evolved over time as to how the processes came to be. Well, let's look at those and see, can they be streamlined, and will that work with the new software? So preparation for the implementation is critical. The other piece we talked about was the people aspect of it. Organizational change management. Is there a plan in place so that when this stress, which it's going to be, when you start asking for people's time and they're trying to figure out how to manage their jobs and also work on the project, how are you going to address that? The training issues. And Joe, you're an OCM expert too, so you can talk a little bit more of that. But if you don't look at the people side of it, you can get the technology in perfectly. It can be completely functional. And if the people don't adopt it, so adoption is one of the biggest reasons implementations fail. The system works fine. People don't use it. They go back to their spreadsheets, back to their Access database, or their whatever workarounds they've come up with over the years. They go back to them, and now you've got a really expensive piece of software that nobody's using.
Yeah, I'm going to I'm going to support one that you mentioned, Bill, and actually add another one. And my past experience, running a large implementer, we ran into these issues all the time, which was taking the time up front. I mentioned on that design doc, and really understanding what it is that's going to be part of this implementation, and really, taking the time up front and really thinking about your future state vision. This is all stuff that we help with on the selection side, as Bill mentioned, including the pre-implementation, right? We're trying to get you ready for the implementation. But on the upfront piece, a lot of times during the sales process, you're going through, hey, this is what we think your future state's going to look like. On the expert witness side, one of the first things we go back and look at is that design doc, right? In the sales process, what was promised? What did you think you were going to get them? So really taking the time to think about that future state, what that future state's going to look like with the technology. And if you're not sure, you really push back on the implementer to say, tell me some things that can happen here. Because as mentioned, those are, at the end of the day, when things start going bad and we start getting them back on track, we really need to say, here's what you thought you were getting. Here's what the functionality you thought was getting. Did you get it? And the like. So you really don't want 12 change orders. Like I said, I'm working on a project now. We've got 4 of the biggest change orders within like 2 months. And that to me is a gigantic red flag. It's like, why did so much change in just a 2-month time frame of functionality and all this other? That just didn't seem logical. And then on the training side, again, most implementers are going to provide you with, they're going to train your project team. Do you have, one of the things that we can provide is, putting together a training plan for your folks. That's generally going to be the client's responsibility to train all their folks. But do you have a plan for each occupation? What skills need to be transferred? How are we going to train them? How are we going to train new people that come on board 3 and 6 months after the go live? So rather than just focus on the training for the go live, is really building that training plan out and say, here's how we're going to do things different at our company. Here's the different people that are impacted. Here's how we're going to train them. And most importantly, having a plan to be able to train new folks that come in. Who's going to do it? What do they need to learn, the like. So those are all things that can truly help things be successful.
Yeah, clearly that's a loaded question. There's a lot a lot of best practices.
How much time do we have?
Yeah. But yeah, I think we could summarize it as long as you communicate with your vendor and you take the time to ensure user adoption, then they can avoid seeing either of you guys for project recovery.
Right.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Oh, I'm gonna throw you one statistic because it just popped in my head when we were talking about adoption. It was based on a number of failed implementation failures, and what they found was that 30% of the time implementation failures are due to technical issues. 70% of the time it's due to adoption, the lack of adoption. So 70% of the failures out there, according to this study anyway, are based on the fact people didn't actually use and adopt the system. The other piece of that survey was they took a look at people's spend in terms of what they spent on the implementation, selection, implementation, everything that went into a cost of putting in the piece of software. They found about 97% of that was spent, again, on the technical issues, which, again, you have to spend that money, agreed, but only about 3% of the spend was on the people side. And I've already talked, and Joe did as well, about how impactful the lack of good organizational change management is to a successful implementation. And Peter's people spending on average 3% of a total spend on something you could easily argue would be the most highest priority within an implementation itself. So
Right.
just saying that, even though we're obviously talking about these numbers from experience, outside services or outside sources have also confirmed exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. And that's what we see. And that, again, to Bill's point, we mentioned earlier, that's when we look on the expert witness side of the house, that's what we see. I mean, we see just overwhelmingly being the organizational change and the project PMO more so than the technology. So that's a good stat, Bill. I haven't heard that one before, so appreciate that.
Yeah, interesting.
Anytime.
Any other questions, Jennifer?
Yeah. Here's one. Our implementation is not failing necessarily, but they keep switching resources on our project. They say we aren't paying for the new resources ramp up time, but what about the lost momentum and potentially missed improvements from not knowing our operations?
So are you asking about the ramp up time, or are you talking about from a new the consulting team lost resources, interchanging resources? Was that the question?
So it sounds like the implementer keeps switching resources
Yeah.
on the project.
Okay.
And then they're worried about the ramp up time and lost momentum. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, that's
go ahead,
Joe.
Bill. I was going to say, I think that's normal. That happens. I don't want to say it's normal, but it happens. And especially, and again, just from, my experience in the software world, if you've planned for a 6 or a 9 month project with these resources, there's going to be things that happen. Folks are going to leave the work, they're going to transition out, things are going to happen. People are going to get sick. That type of stuff happens. But I would say, again, as most of the software vendors are trying to staff the project for that given amount of time as per the plan, right? And when things start stretching out and they start going over that and they're supposed to be working on other projects or they have other commitments, it really shows the importance of setting realistic expectations up front, setting a clear go live and try and get to that go live date. Because resources are going to change. It happens a lot in the client side too. I brought up the example earlier where 3 of the top project leads from the company all left within 2 months, and it just caused a gigantic problem. So I would say that these things kind of go both ways. The important thing is sometimes is maybe not think so short-sighted on the cost and say, what's it going to take to get me an expert up to speed and get this project on track and keep it on track so we can get to go live. So that's kind of my opinion on that. Bill?
Well, when there's turnover from the implementer standpoint, there can be 2 issues, as you've already mentioned. One of which is the implementer's committed to new clients, and they're switching resources off to work on some potentially bigger client. I mean, that does happen. But another scenario which happens frequently too is that the client is not doing their side. They're we're trying to run their business, and so the length of the implementation is extending, which means now that the implementer's committed resources to get to X amount of hours per month to do these functions, and they don't have the ability to do that because the client's not turning around documents or whatever else they've committed to. So the implementer said they're going, I can't have someone that's only working 40% of their time working on this project. They have to be able to pick up additional work because we're not profitable at people being utilized 40% of the time. So it's incumbent upon both organizations to follow the project plan in terms of when things are going to happen, the stage gates. And as you already mentioned, Joe, stuff happens. People get sick. Some act of God happens. Whatever it is, things do occur. And then generally that's already anticipated in the project plan to some degree. But if it's continuous and it's, you just keep seeing it time after time where people aren't making, turning documents around or attending meetings from the client standpoint, that's what's going to happen. The implementer is going to switch out resources. The other thing that the SOW should state in the statement of work that the client's signing off, that they have sign off or they have first refusal rights on who's coming on their project. When they're saying, okay, we're putting in a new PM. Well, what kind of credibility do they have? What kind of experience do they have? I, as a client, ought to be able to say, okay, that looks good or not. And of course, yes, I don't pay for their ramp up time. And that question I heard was, what about opportunity costs? Well, now we've delayed things. Everybody else in the project is also losing time because this project manager is getting up to speed. So again, this affects both sides, and that's not an easy question to answer. But again, a very tight SOW is a client's best protection around these types of problems. You can't completely get rid of them, but the less ambiguity, and you can spell out, I've got we're going to approve anybody that comes on, and the certain amount of turnover, whatever it is acceptable, and beyond that, there's replication, or there's consequences.
And again, I think from my experience, most of the time we see those changes coming not so much early in the project, but more so as you can almost guarantee some type of turnover changes once you start going past that initial go live date. As we mentioned before, even on the internal side, it's really hard to keep the internal resources focused above and beyond. If you think about the kickoff meeting and how big of an initiative this is for your company, and you get everybody up and running and on board, and why this is going to help your company, prosper going forward and meet your future state goals. Staying on track and keeping that momentum is one of the toughest things in these projects. So it's really both sides need to, build the plan, work the plan, keep the resources committed to the best of your ability, and try and stay on track. So,
hey Joe, was my hand annoying enough there?
Oh, there's your hand. I didn't see your hand.
Yeah, no, I was trying to be annoying. What I was going to say is, if you think there's turnover in a regular implementation, how about a recovery? How about after people have been doing this for a year or 2 years, and they're sick and tired of this project, and they say, well, guess what? We're going to extend it another 9 months because we have to recover. You want to see turnover, that's when turnover also occurs. When you've said, okay, things are really jacked up. Now I need you to put in double the effort that you did before, because we got to get back to trying to recover this project. So again, another thing to be very conscious of, if you're going into a recovery, that your team is prepared, and they've got the ability to actually be able to make that kind of time commitment again. So again, something very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Bill, finally, the last point on that, we can actually quantify that. We can actually see where the same issues stay on the status reports week after week, and they're red. They're red, meaning critical. As these things go on and on, you can see the momentum gets lost, and we see that a lot. It's like, why went from 140 issues to 230 issues over the last 6 weeks, and just things start losing momentum. So we can actually quantify and see those breaks, and know that it's time to kind of, from a recovery perspective, those are some of the things that we look at and it's like, okay, we need to kickstart this thing again and get it going. So.
Well, Jennifer, is that, are we wrapped up, or is there anything else in there?
That's all the time we have for questions. So to conclude today's webinar, I'll do another plug for Panorama Consulting Group. Please visit their website to learn more about getting your ERP project back on track, regardless of the challenges you're facing. Thank you, Joe and Bill, and thank you to our audience. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.